Hi, I think we're going to begin today's program. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Judy Margles. I'm the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I thank everyone for joining today's program, Racism, Protest, and Law Enforcement, Historical Context for Contemporary Times. The program is sponsored by my institution and the Oregon Historical Society. I really want to extend a special thanks to Eliza Canty-Jones, the Historical Society's Community Engagement Manager and editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Eliza has been an exceptional partner in planning this program and others that we have co-sponsored together. Thank you, Eliza. I'm also enormously grateful to our panelists that we've been able to put together this program so quickly when there's so much going on. And I'm also glad that we're gathering today, the day before Juneteenth. It's really a powerful reminder that our national history was, of course, built on the enslavement of African Americans. So today, 155 years following the Emancipation Proclamation, we're witnessing an unprecedented number of Americans and communities around the globe who are marching in protest against violent racism that has disproportionately and brutally targeted Black Americans. And although we have a long way to go, I have to say these protests, and I've talked a little bit with the panelists about this, they've really encouraged me, and I hope all of you to look forward with a modicum of hope. Maybe we can say that. I think you'll all agree that the need for understanding where we are today in the context of our history has a particular urgency. I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, Marisa Chappell, who will then introduce our guests. Marisa Chappell is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University and the author of The War on Welfare, Family, Poverty, and Politics in Modern America, and the co-author of Welfare in the United States, A History with Documents. She has published articles in numerous scholarly journals and newspapers and has served as an editor on the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Professor Chappell is currently a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. Thank you all for being here today, and with pleasure, I introduce Marisa Chappell.
Thank you, Judy. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel. The way this is going to work over the next hour is I'm going to introduce our three panelists and then begin some conversation. If you have questions or issues you'd like to hear the panelists address, please use the Zoom Q&A function, and I'll be monitoring that along our conversation. We're very lucky to have three incredible scholars to speak today about the complexities of our current moment in historical perspective. Dr. Angela E. Addae is an assistant professor at the University of Oregon Law School, where she focuses on urban development, race, and organizational structure. Her latest research, Saving Black Portland, examines how municipal redevelopment policies affect neighborhood organizations in North and Northeast Portland. Prior to joining the University of Oregon, Dr. Addae practiced as a litigation attorney, primarily representing Oregon's small businesses and large corporations in federal court. She's also a member of the Oregon Commission on Black Affairs, the Oregon chapter of the National Bar Association, and the Portland Alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Judson L. Jeffries is professor of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. He is author of 8 books, including one about the Black Panthers in Portland, Oregon. He has held prestigious fellowships and taught at Harvard University, Morehouse College, and Virginia Tech. He is a Phi Beta Kappa and a member of the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. His areas of specialization include police community relations, political repression, and 20th century uprisings. Finally, Dr. Joseph Lowndes is a professor of political science at the University of Oregon. He's published widely on the history of race, white nationalism, and political conservatism, and he's an active observer and analyst of contemporary groups organizing around anti-Semitic, white supremacist, anti-government, and militia activity. Thank you all for being here for this conversation. To begin, I'd just like to ask each of you to draw on your own scholarship and tell us how you're reflecting on the current moment. What are the key insights of your work for understanding where we are and how we got here?
I'll go first. So I would venture to say that all racial injustices against Black people are badges and incidents of slavery in the United States. So slavery can be seen as the source, essentially, from which all racial injustice emanates. Mass incarceration, we can point back to slavery. The wealth gap, tied to slavery. Health disparities, tied to slavery. Education gap, slavery, right? So we have to first confront that these are all badges and incidents of slavery, and then we can kind of start the conversation there. And even further, chattel slavery in the United States taught white people to oppress and dehumanize Black people. Just the practice of enslaving Black people, right? The mere act of treating another human being as property, layered with the brutality and violence and that went along with that institution. I think that white Americans were stripped at a fundamental level of capacity to have empathy for Black people or to see Black people as human. So what we see today is just manifestations in various iterations of that dehumanization. And those deprivations, right, they're compounded over generations.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. You know, as Professor Addae said, white supremacy animates almost everything in American political life. There's no political issue that race doesn't touch. And so we're at a moment when racialization has really come to the center of US politics in a way that is, absolutely undeniable wherever you look. And so partly in this moment, there is both, there's been rising white nationalism, rising open white supremacy, really all the way from, when I was studying this stuff 20 years ago, you'd have kind of like conservatives, you have the Republican Party, then you had conservatives, and then you had a far right. And now all three of those things are kind of one entity. So, from one perspective, there is a Trumpist Republican Party, which is, become, for many purposes, a far right party of the Central European variety. And this is, this has extraordinary effects in the state of Oregon and nationally. On the other side, there is now radical mobilization around the issue of not just police brutality, but the institution of police itself, which has been building for some time through progressive waves of protest against dehumanization, against brutality, against police murder, which has now reached a point, in the sound of a second cycle of Black Lives Matter protests, which opens up territory for new kinds of emancipatory visions. And this is worldwide, right? We're seeing this across the country. And then, statues of slavers being pulled down in Bristol, England, and thrown into the river. Winston Churchill has to be kept in a box there now, a statue of him. And so really all across the Caribbean, across Latin America, this is kind of an anti-slavery and anti-colonial moment with really extraordinary effects and far-reaching effects on public policy, on symbolism, and really how we regard our own history. And then part of the fights around these monuments right now has to do with really understanding who we are in this moment.
Dr. Jeffries, would you like to weigh in here? We cannot hear you. Okay, well, while we work on that audio, let me pick up on a point that Dr. Lowndes made about this moment sort of opening up an opportunity for emancipatory visions. We hear a lot in the media comparing the moment we're in now to the 1960s in a whole variety of ways. And could you speak to sort of, what do you think of those comparisons? What is like the 60s right now and what is not like the 60s right now? What's different?
I'll just jump in quickly. I think one of the you know, a lot of the comparisons that have been made to the 67 riots, or kind of the series of uprisings that happened from starting with Watts in 1965, moving through Newark and Detroit and other cities, culminating after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. And partly those uprisings or protests, many of them were triggered by incidents of police killings and police brutality, but they often were they were localized in Black neighborhoods. Again, also the same is true of the 1992 riots following the verdicts of the 4 cops who beat Rodney King. But this wave era of protests sees something really different, where these are broad, Black-led, but multiracial protests involving hundreds of thousands of people. And the targets have not just been, people's own neighborhoods, but, tonier business districts of West Philadelphia, or Rodeo Drive in Los Angeles or Beverly Hills, Midtown Manhattan. And so there's something broader here about really targeting, symbols of kind of exploitive consumerism and corporations, as well as connected to questions of racialized domination. So there's something about this which feels different in terms of this broader set of trajectories, I think.
Dr. Jeffries.
Okay, so I had to get on my telephone because something's going on with the computer, which will not allow me to audio. So let me get to the first question first quickly. So I am the editor of the Journal of African American Studies, and for years I would get tons of submissions on police use of excessive force against people of African descent. In the last, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years, I have typically not been open-minded about getting such submissions because the scholarship focuses on describing the problem. We're well beyond that. We know what the problem is. So nowadays, I'm only interested in scholarship that talks about police use of excessive force against people of African descent and what we need to do in order to eradicate it. So where I am in my scholarship, and then the matter on the ground is talking about what can we do as Americans to curb this malicious criminal activity on behalf of some of America's rogue cops. So that's where I am, and that's the issue that I'm concerned about right now.
Thank you. That really raises a central question here, right? In the mainstream conversation, the term violence is so often used to describe property destruction that occasionally occurs, right? Rather than the violence that American society has consistently targeted at Black Americans and other communities of color. And I mean, not only police brutality, right, but economic and environmental violence. So perhaps our panelists could speak to how should we be thinking about violence, where it's centered, both historically and today?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Marisa. Like, the violence is and always has been against Black people, essentially, right? Like, violence has been pretty much the only language in which Black people have been communicated to. The message is, you don't belong here. The message is, I'm better than you. And Black people are subjugated in very violent ways. I mean, I mentioned earlier the institution of slavery. That was a violent institution. But also, going back to your earlier question, the civil rights movement of the 1960s was also rooted in racial violence. I think that we as a society tend to have a very selective recollection of that movement. But when I think about the civil rights movement, I think about those 4 little girls in that Birmingham church basement. I think about the lynchings at the hands of white mobs, which, by the way, included law enforcement. I think about the bloody gash on the skull of Representative John Lewis. I think about the bombs in the home of Medgar Evers. I think about police dogs, fire hoses, right, aimed at peaceful protesters. So even today, moving forward, we talk about police brutality, but the way in which America communicates with Black people is through the very violent oppression and control of Black bodies. So what does that look like outside of police brutality, which is also very violent? I mean, disproportionately locking up Black people in cages, essentially, right? High maternal mortality rates for Black women, lack of access to clean water, Flint, Michigan, right? Fresh air, fresh food for Black children. All of these things are still rooted in violence. And I mean, these things go towards the very existence of our beings as humans.
But those last two comments, I got a question from an audience member about police abolition. Can we touch on police abolition and the way we can get there?
What does police abolition mean?
I would turn that back on you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what it means among activists today, what it should mean based on your scholarship.
So I've been hearing two terms in the last couple of weeks: police abolition and defunding of police. And until someone can explain to me, or define what defunding police and police abolition means, I'm not sure that I personally can talk intelligently on the matter. So when people talk about police abolition, are we talking about dismantling police agencies across the United States of America? Are we talking about going back to a period? I'm old enough, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, I'm old enough to remember when many police officers called themselves peace officers, P-E-A-C-E. And these peace officers oftentimes did not surveil or police neighborhoods behind the windshield of a vehicle, but oftentimes policed neighborhoods or monitored them by walking a beat. So if we're talking about going back to that kind of era, that's something I can definitely get behind, because oftentimes what was happening is when an officer walked a beat, the officer became intimately familiar with the community and vice versa, and that improved the quality of policing. If, however, one is talking about the complete eradication of police agencies, there's where I say, hey, listen, let's pump the brakes a little. On the question of defunding the police, again, same thing applies. What is it that we mean by that? Can we defund police agencies in such a way where it is punitive against them, but at the same time does not impede their ability to provide the kind of services that the public deserves? So until we can flesh those out, I'm not sure that we can move forward on those rather novel ideas.
You know, there is a good question with the question of either abolition or defunding. It immediately raised the question of what these things mean, as Professor Jeffries said, and as the questioner asked. I think one of the things about defunding police that activists mean when they bring it up have to do with what's the role of the police, what is the scope of the role of police in community. So are they there to deal with child, protective services? Are they there to deal with problems that arise from, a vastly increased homelessness in the United States? Are they there to be in high schools and middle schools, and in some cases elementary schools? One of the questions I think there is, why are the police called on to take on all these different roles? Why is armed law enforcement, armored and armed law enforcement, the tool that we use to manage or try to resolve or at least ameliorate the multiple crises we have in society? So I think one of the questions that come up around defund is where might those resources be put differently? So partly what's happening now on the ground, say for instance in Eugene, Oregon, where I am, the school board just voted to take armed police out of the school system. So that's, part of it is like the question was raised: why do we need armed cops in the schools? What role does that play, and what dangers does it does it give? And what happens when you have, what potentially happens when you have armed police in schools? And what does this have to do with a broader problem of police to prisons pipelines? And particularly, what does it mean for Black and Indigenous people of color to have police in these schools who are made the most vulnerable? Questions also come up as a college professor, whether or not we should have armed campus cops, here as well. So there's all these different areas where you could decide whether or not it's appropriate for police to be the ones managing these problems, which is not to say there's not also racist problems with many of these other institutions like Child Protective Services, but that's part of it. Police abolition is really tied to the aspirational vision of prison abolition and decarceration in society more broadly, that it's about imagining a society where we don't have the kinds of conflicts that, there's all kinds of issues and questions that are raised about this, but it raises a set of questions about what are the police for? Who are they there to serve? What problems are there to confront? And these are, frankly, questions, that actually have to do with concrete questions of power, like the power of police unions and what they do and what kind of power they exercise over local city councils or state legislatures or governor's offices. And so there's all kinds of things that come up in this, but you can only get there by beginning to talk about who the police are and what they're there to do, not just reform of, not just body cams or implicit bias training or de-escalation training, right? This is something more profound than that, I think.
And I'll add on that. I think that without getting into like the semantics of what defunding actually means, to the extent that we're talking about like reallocating funds to crucial and neglected social services like education or public health, housing, youth services, all of these things that directly address societal problems like poverty, like mental illness, like homelessness, right? Like these are issues that police are just poorly equipped to handle, yet they're tasked with that, right? So policing, which I think kind of what he was saying, was never really meant to serve that role. It was never really meant to solve those social problems. But at the same time, what we do know is that incremental police reform has really failed to combat police violence in any meaningful way, right? And that's, I think, why we're here. So you talk about body cameras, for example. I think in 2014, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, there was like a nationwide push for body cameras. But essentially, body cameras had almost zero effect on deterring police officers from acting with unnecessary force, right? I mean, and the reality is, Rodney King was brutally beaten in 1991. So that means that, and it was caught on camera. So that means that for 30 years, police have been using excessive force on camera, and so the push for body cameras is just one example of like that incremental reform. We can ask for body cameras, but either the police officers turn them off, or all we have are more videos of police killing Black men on camera. So same thing with chokeholds, right? The New York Police Department banned chokeholds like 2 decades ago. Yet Eric Garner was still killed via a chokehold by a police officer. So these are all things that when we're talking about, dismantling or defunding police departments, et cetera, like we have to think about the reality is we can't legislate our way out of implicit bias. We can't defund implicit bias, right? These are things that are ingrained in society. And I think that's what we have to deal with at the core.
Let me mention a few other things, if I may, please. Let me focus my comments on the police officer. So first and foremost, we have to figure out a way to recruit a better caliber of police officer. We have to figure out a way to recruit a higher character of person who endeavors to be a police officer, as well as those who ordinarily would not consider police work as a vocation, we have to find a way to incentivize them to get on the police force, right? So in Portland, Oregon, many years ago, there was a distinguished police officer by the name of Penny Harrington. I haven't spoken to Ms. Harrington in years, but she was one of the first female police chiefs of a major American city. What Penny Harrington tried to do was what? Increase the standards in order to become a police officer. And one of the things she did was she said, hey, listen, I'm going to implement a policy whereby if you want to become a police officer, you have to have a college degree. Her thinking was simply that the more education a person has, the more civilized they would behave, and that perhaps we would get a more cosmopolitan person on the force, and that would have all kind of ripple effects. That makes all the sense in the world, right? She was, for all intents and purposes, run out of town for implementing that policy. But I think it was a great one that we should revisit. Two, studies that I've done over the years shown this, that the folk who are more likely to exhibit extra legal force against motorists and pedestrians are male police officers, right? This is not to say anything silly like female police officers aren't guilty of this kind of rogue behavior themselves, but they are significantly less likely to engage in harsh policing of pedestrians and motorists than are male police officers. The evidence just bears that out. 3, the overwhelming majority, although I think this is changing, the overwhelming majority of Americans do not realize this. So when police officers are found having exhibited disproportionate force in order to subdue a motorist or a pedestrian, what happens is oftentimes that police officer isn't charged, let alone convicted or sentenced to jail. But what happens is the city ends up paying huge settlements to the families of the victims. And what most Americans do not fully understand, I would argue, I would bet dollars to donuts that most Americans are oblivious to this, that those settlements are coming out of our pockets. Our tax dollars are those settlements. And I think if we did a better job of educating Americans and letting them know that we are actually paying for some police officers to misbehave, I think we will see a difference in the attitudes of many Americans with regard to this issue. Because once you start talking about how people's pocketbooks are impacted, then you get their attention. And then finally, hey, listen, everyone is familiar with the 3 strikes law, right? Well, we need to have something like that for police officers who engage in this kind of street murder, right? So I think when police officers are charged, it's only recently that police officers are even being charged for criminal behavior, let alone convicted or sentenced. When police officers are charged, convicted, and sentenced, and they're serving long sentences, this will get officers attention. What has historically been the case is you've had law enforcement. When I say law enforcement, I'm talking about America's street-level bureaucrats, meaning police officers, prosecutors, and district attorneys, right, being very friendly with one another. And as a result, right, you have the legal system protecting police officers, and as a result, they don't get charged. And one of the things I've been telling my students who've been emailing me, and I'll finish here, is that, hey, listen, district attorneys and prosecutors in various places of the country are elected into positions. So we have to take advantage of the vote.
Thanks, Dr. Jeffries. Yeah, and I would add, you know, that shareholders are gaining wealth from those settlements as well, right? Because the cities are selling bonds to pay off those lawsuits.
Indeed.
I think what we're seeing here in this discussion is really interesting because we see that there are all these different proposals for reform, right? And can we recruit better people? Can we do better training? But then there's this fundamental issue that abolitionists bring up, which is that the system, right, that we see Black police officers committing brutality against a Black population. So is there something systemic, right? The idea is we have to dismantle the entire system. And it raises a question from an audience member who says, last night I watched The Rape of Recy Taylor on Netflix. One of the points made by the narrator was that sheriffs started as runaway slave catchers, right? This is a point that Dr. Addae brought up. How much does that legacy of sheriffs and I would say other functions that the police took historically, right, in sort of suppressing working class populations and populations of color, how much does that history sort of impact what we're looking at today systemically?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. So kind of following up on what Professor Jeffries' comments were, I know we're talking about police officer and law enforcement right now, but I honestly think that the emphasis on police officers is misplaced. I think that police officers, like every other person, is subject to the dominant ideologies of our society. So, for example, George Zimmerman was not a police officer. The murderer of Trayvon Martin. Gregory and Travis McMichael, Ahmaud Arbery's murderers, were not active duty police officers, yet they still served the role in that moment as judge, jury, and executioner. So I say that to say that these ideas and notions are ingrained and have been ingrained in American society since the very founding of this nation. And I would venture to say that racism, right, as a concept, is as American as apple pie. I mean, if we're being honest. And so, there's a lot of conversations about laws and what legal reforms can we invoke, but we have laws. We have the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection and due process, right? But none of the people that we're talking about, none of the victims that we can name ever received due process. And that was on the basis of their race. They were deprived of that due process. They were deprived of that equal protection under the law because of their race. We have the 13th Amendment, we have the Civil Rights Act, and many others. So all of these laws say that people must be treated equally, yet that is not reflected in our lived experiences. To the extent that we're talking about the legal system in general, or the criminal legal system in general, even the people that we see on camera committing these brutal acts of violence still act with impunity, right? Even after we see it with our own eyes. So I say that to say that reform, to the extent that we're interested in reform, is going to require a fundamental culture shift, right? We have to legalize Blackness, normalize Blackness. Like, we're not other, So I think as a society, we need to take a zero tolerance approach to racism. I think we should view racism like other immoral acts, right? Acts that we consider to be repulsive, acts of immorality. And so imagine a society in which we were shocked. It shocked our conscience every time we experienced or saw or witnessed racism. Imagine if you couldn't actually be racist and violence toward Black people and get away with it, right? And so, that reform is going to require, again, a fundamental culture shift that's not necessarily rooted in or tied to, police policy or trainings and things like that.
On the matter of training, just real quickly. Yeah, I think we need to put that matter in its proper place in our pockets. And the reason why I say this is because police use of excessive force against people of color has absolutely nothing to do with training. Some folk are using that to mask the real problem. The real problem is, hey, listen, There are police officers who believe that they can, first of all, they believe that blacks merit harsher policing. And second, they believe that if they cross the line, right, that there is no consequence for doing so, right? So the gentleman in the city of Minneapolis who nailed on Mr. Floyd's neck for darn near 9 minutes did so because he believed that, hey, listen, at the end of the day, the system would protect him, despite the fact that there are increasing numbers of police officers going to jail for committing these kind of crimes, like the police officer who shot, I believe it was Mr. Scott in the back numerous times in South Carolina. This is a new development. We've seen this in increasing numbers in a way we hadn't seen this before. But the guy in Minnesota, in his mind, he's thinking, hey, listen, there won't be any consequence for me doing this. It has nothing to do with training. He knew exactly the kind of training he was to employ then. He ignored that. He chose to do this. This was a black life. Black lives have historically been devalued, and he proceeded with that thinking in mind. So let's stop talking about police officers need more training, because that's not the issue at all.
Thanks. Dr. Lowndes, did you have an input?
Just briefly, a couple of things. I mean, one, just to Professor Jeffries' point, I think he's absolutely right. And a key here again is the role of police unions. I mean, you know, the way that institutions work and actors in institutions is to defend and protect what they are. You know, that's partly who police are defending and protecting, is their own, you know, their own ability to act with impunity. And, you know, Police Benevolent Association and other police unions have extraordinary power, again, over politicians, over elected officials. And that actually is something that's very hard to penetrate and very hard to break. And we see it over and over in major cities and also smaller cities as well. So this is, you know, part of the conversation here is about where the actual power here lies. The only other thing I would say is that it's almost like the police problem in the United States comes from two angles. One, as Professor Addae said, the history of white supremacy, which governs this country, back to slave catchers and anti-Indian militias as well. But the other is that the police is a modern institution. It's not, we think of it as something that's always been there, but really goes back to the, Marisa, you're a historian, late 19th century or mid 19th century. And I think the first police were deployed in Ireland, you know, over local populations. And so if you can think about the question of who gets policed, who gets governed by police, what populations are thought of as needing to be policed, it's always, you know, colonized people or poor people, right? And it's managed on behalf of some other interest. So part of this question about police really has to do, we should think more broadly about why we have this institution and what purpose it serves. And if you get a country, a settler colonial and slavery state like the United States, it's like, you know, it's like the worst of all worlds together. And so this is why we see this, you know, these brutalities here in a way that, go far beyond where you see elsewhere, both as a carceral effect, but also just in terms of police actions.
It's so important, and it's one way, right, that history can really help us, is to denaturalize these kind of institutions. I want to get to a few more questions from our audience. And one set of questions has to do with guns. I think it's very important and related to what you're talking about. The question is, I see the way that militarization of police has profited the same armament manufacturers that have increased the number of guns that regular Americans own. If I were an officer, the flood of guns would terrify me. Will we see any potential to address gun safety as a corollary to police reforms, particularly given the number of African Americans who've been shot and killed for legally possessing guns, right? So I'm wondering if any of you want to speak to guns as part of this constellation.
Well, okay. Oh, go ahead, Professor Addae.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. But see, what the questioner needs to recognize is that sometimes the killing of motorists and pedestrians are done in the absence of firearms, right? asphyxiation, like we just saw in Minneapolis as a result of the guy kneeling, and chokeholds. So while I appreciate the question about guns, at the end of the day, I mean, there are any number of ways that police officers employ their training to end a person's life. At the end of the day, hey, listen, the militarization of police departments and the professionalization of police departments was brought on in the 1960s by the LAPD, by a legendary police officer by the name of Daryl Gates. So when we start trying to unpack this relationship between gun manufacturers and law enforcement in the United States, I mean, good luck with that. I mean, that's a very cozy relationship that benefits both economically in huge ways. Is about all I can say about that.
Professor Addae?
I would agree with that. And I just add that ultimately capitalism tends to be at the core of most of the things that when we dig deep enough, we'll find capitalism at the core. But I also note that when we talk about gun reform, I mean, guns haven't necessarily been the issue, right? Because the reality is Black people cannot own guns legally. I mean, you know, like we talked about, there's a lot of emphasis when we're talking about these different victims about them being unarmed. But even if they were armed, they, you know, that's not illegal. Being armed isn't illegal. And so even in instances where people have lawfully possessed guns, their lives are still ended, not because that they were posing a particular threat, but because they were a Black person with a gun in their hand or something that looked like a gun. And so just the stripping away of that Second Amendment right to possess firearms, which leads to death sentences for a lot of Black men. I think that speaks again to the core issue, which is it's not about who has guns and who doesn't, but rather about the fear that's applied when the inherent fear when someone sees a Black person or when someone sees a Black man.
Dr. Lowndes, I wonder if you could speak to the role of firearms in white supremacist movements and whiteness and what that's looked like historically.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say before is that, everybody's armed in this country, but it's only certain populations that, get the focus by armed police. But, the other thing is that gun control laws first started in this country in the late 60s as a result of the Black Panther Party members from Oakland marching on the state legislature in Sacramento, right, with legally holding, 22s and shotguns. And so it's the fear of Black people with arms that drives, these fears. And so that's, there's no actually talking about the Second Amendment or guns or any of this in the American context without that being part of it. And we can track the history of the NRA, which starts out as kind of a, they're through their magazine, The Rifleman. This is kind of like a, Field and Stream type organization, a magazine. And then it becomes much more politicized in these almost proto-fascist ways by the time you get to 2016, 2017. And it's because of racial and political divides in the country. So I think, those are key parts about it. But the other thing is that police are using, obviously, lethal force on unarmed protesters around the country right now to devastating effect and to fatal effect. But if you go to, protests by far-right groups, either these reopen protests that have happened around the country or these kind of Antifa protests that have showed up in small towns, around the country, these are people armed to the teeth. Every time I go to a far-right rally, it's like AR-15s everywhere and sidearms and everything else. And the police aren't doing anything about that. And we also have armed militias on the far right who, in many cases, are, well, often these are either ex-police or sometimes even current police off duty. But also, if they show up really armed, covered in Kevlar, and armed to the teeth, that actually changes the balance of power, even if the police did want to move on them, right? So we actually have, if we're actually really concerned about what this means and risks to the general populace in terms of arms, organized armed militias like the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers or other groups are really kind of a threat to the polity in that sense.
Professor Lowndes, you said a mouthful there. One thing I want to comment on quickly, you mentioned the Black Panther Party. You know, I was around when the uprisings took place in the city of Los Angeles in the wake of the 4 LAPD officers being acquitted for savagely beating him. The difference, one of the differences, there's several differences, but one of the differences I see between Los Angeles and what's been taking place recently is, wow, police using harsh methods to quell protesters in a way that I didn't really witness wholesale in LA. It's not that they didn't do it in LA, but I'm witnessing this wholesale here in May and June 2020. The other thing is the use of extra legal force against journalists and reporters is something that I most definitely didn't see in Los Angeles. And I was sharing with a student of mine the other day, this is as close to a police state as I have seen in my lifetime. And she went on to ask me, well, Dr. Jeffries, since you've written several books on the Black Panther Party, what are your thoughts about revisiting it? And I said to her, listen, when we see these YouTube videos of police using excessive force against someone, man, woman, or child, I applaud the folk who are standing around and filming it. But it may get to a point where folks in this country have to revert back to something that they were doing in the 60s called fighting police. And they may have to put the cameras down after getting a certain amount of footage and intervene. I hate to say that. Otherwise, we're going to have instances like the ones we saw in Dallas and Texas, where in the wake of Black men being shot down in the street by police officers, you had 2 guys who apparently had said to themselves they couldn't take it anymore, and they went to the streets and ambushed several police officers, resulting in nearly a dozen fatalities. And we certainly don't want people going in the street and indiscriminately killing police officers. We can't have that kind of anarchy. At the same time, when my student raised the issue of the Black Panther Party, that's something that may need to be considered. Qualified folk in neighborhoods monitoring police activity and causing police to think twice about snuffing out a Black life.
Thank you. I'd like to get to, we've had several questions about Oregon in particular. So questions related to Oregon's Black exclusion laws, about is there something different here in Portland and Oregon that's going on now that's gone on in the past, or does it just follow patterns of other places? Does anybody have anything to weigh in on there?
Sure. Unfortunately, Oregon is not different. I'd assert. I think Oregon, like every other place, is subject again to the same ideologies that are rooted in racism. And I'm from Mississippi originally, and I get a lot of, oh, what's it like in Mississippi? It must have been really bad. And I'm like, oh, geez. Well, Oregon at the founding of the state excluded black people by law, right? The state constitution banned Black people from living in Oregon, from conducting business in Oregon, from using the courts in Oregon, and it was punishable by law. And so Oregon wasn't necessarily originated as a slave state, but it was, and I'm not gonna say it was worse, but it was a state that didn't want Black people within its borders free or enslaved, right? And so Oregon was founded as a white utopia, and we see manifestations of that today. Oregon, even from that founding, has a history of racial exclusion We can think about even once there started to be an influx of Black people in Oregon, particularly after World War II and around World War II, when a lot of Black people moved to Portland to work in the shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards. But even now, I mean, gentrification, for example, that's a part of this legacy. And that's something that I've been talking about a bit in Portland in particular, how we're living out this history right now by seeing the displacement and the dismantlement of this Black community in Portland. It's happening right now, right before our eyes, but we're ignoring it because we're not conditioned to see the stories of Black people. We're not conditioned to see the harms associated with Black people, the violence against Black people. So that legacy of racial exclusion, particularly unique to the state of Oregon, that framework for racial exclusion in the state constitution, right, still plays out today in Oregon in a very specific way. And I would say it's almost very dangerous of Oregonians to see themselves as progressive or different or exceptional in some way, because that adds to the erasure of these narratives for Black Oregonians.
Yeah, Dr. Lowndes, I wonder if white supremacy and the white nationalism in Oregon, is it particular? Is there something particular here, or no?
Well, you know, the Klan was always really active, or the second wave of the Klan, which would have been in the early 20th century, was quite active throughout the state and in towns and cities here. And there's been successive waves since then of kind of racist and white nationalist activity. In the early 1990s, the White Aryan Resistance chose Portland as a place, as an organizing place. Partly their dream was organizing white working class young people into kind of neo-Nazi formations. And partly they chose Portland because they had an idea that cities that had fewer than 10% people of color were cities that you could organize in. If they try to do this in like Chicago or Detroit, they're going to get their asses kicked or whatever. So it's like, here's a place where they're going to go. They can do this kind of organizing. And there was intense skinhead activity here in the 90s, which was famous for the infamous for the beating to death of an Ethiopian bus driver, Mugaluda Sarah, and which finally put the White Aryan Resistance out of business. But since then, the kind of generally, and since the 1980s, this vision of a white ethno-state, a lot of white nationalists, white supremacists began to think like, all right, we're going to lose America, but we can actually have some kind of state, some kind of separate state. And the Pacific Northwest is the place that's always seen as the whitest part of the country. And so there's been experiment after experiment in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon to set up kind of like white exclusive zones, often very violent. So that, you know, that's part of the history, you know. Here's one, and you know, there's lots of present day neo-Nazi and Klan activity throughout the state.
My rudimentary knowledge of Portland's history prompts me to respond this way to your question. Based on my studies of Portland, it doesn't seem that it is appreciably different than other major cities, other than it being the whitest major city in the United States of America. It doesn't seem to be appreciably different from other major cities where matters of race is concerned. Otherwise, the city would not have given birth to a branch of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s, which incidentally, I've argued, was one of the more effective branches of the Black Panther Party in the organization's history. And indeed, the Portland Black Panthers were around significantly longer than any number of other branches and chapters in the United States, lasting about 10 years. So the fact that there were blacks and whites who thought that a Black Panther branch in Portland was needed speaks volumes.
I think the audio got out on Dr. Jeffries. So we are rapidly reaching 1 o'clock. I'd love to try to capture a couple sets of questions, put them out there and hear what you have to say in closing? One set of questions has to do with how today's human rights activists might have learned from the past and be doing things maybe more constructively to greater effect. The second set of questions has to do with going back to Dr. Addae's argument that we need some kind of big cultural shift, right? How do we as educators help to facilitate that kind of a profound cultural shift? So I think both of these are kind of hopeful questions. And so if you want to speak to either of those or say something else in closing, I'll give you that opportunity.
Sure. I think this is a unique opportunity, at least, for people to start thinking about how do we undo racism, which is kind of what the question is. And unfortunately, racism permeates everything we touch, everything we do, everything we think, even for Black people, right? Black people are not immune from internalizing the messaging around dehumanization and, oppression, right? And so instead of saying, I'm not racist, which is a lot of people's reactions when we try to confront racism, like, oh, I'm not racist. How about we just admit that we've been all indoctrinated with these same ideologies that are rooted in racism, right? And so by doing that, we can kind of let go of those empty platitudes and these kind of performative measures and really just commit to doing the work, commit to doing the work individually, commit to doing the work on in your lane, in your particular niche of your corner of the world, and then combat the institutional and the systemic racism as well. So it's not going to be a smooth process. It's not going to be linear. It's not going to be comfortable. The conversations aren't going to be peachy, right? And so once we confront that and we just acknowledge that this is going to take a lot of dirty work and we have to do what it takes, and we got to commit to that as a society. I mean, I think that's the first step, right? So thinking about it on an individual level, on kind of a meso level, and then also at a systematic or institutional level.
Thank you. I think that's so important, that idea of we have to be actively anti-racist rather than simply say we're not racist, right? Dr. Jeffries, did you have a kind of final thought, or Dr. Lowndes, whatever order y'all want to go in?
Yeah, I'll let Professor Lowndes go.
I would just say, in the spirit of staying in one's lane, as Professor Addae brought up, I think for white folks, partly it's to concentrate in the places where we work and places we live and around our relatives and friends and people who work, to challenge racism where it comes up and have conversations about it and talk about what these things are, what they mean, how they're rooted in history, how we may not be responsible for what happened in the past, but we actually are responsible for what happens in the present. The other thing I think is that white people have a lot to gain from anti-racist struggles, right? I mean, the fact that we have more people in prison than any other country in the world by number or by percentage means that there's a lot of white folks locked up in prison as well, right? There's a lot of white folks who are victims of police brutality as well. Police violence grows out of our white supremacist history, but it ends up hurting other folks as well. So I think you take a place like Oregon that's got like Southern and Eastern Oregon, places where there's no 911 service, where there's no public library. So these places, they're like an abandoned by the state and by capital. There's a lot of things that people could imagine. There's things that. What are the similarities with Flint? What are the similarities with Ferguson? There are differences, and those differences matter. But there's also ways in which we're all helped by anti-racist struggles. We're all helped by this, and white folks should see that not just as a thing about shame and privilege, but about actually, also contributing to broader struggles of liberation.
Yeah, this idea that when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter, right? I think that's really important. Dr. Jeffries.
So one of the things I try to hammer home with my students is I say one of my charges is to get them to understand that they have an obligation to use their degree and the skills and tools that they acquire from the Ohio State University, to use those tools in such a way where they uplift the race. I'm talking about the human race. So I try to disabuse students of the idea that, hey, listen, the goal is to come to college, get that sheepskin called a diploma, then get out there and get a job and be all about you, be all about the bling. And I said, hey, listen, at the end of the day, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of Brown versus Board of Education, although he didn't live to see it come to fruition, he handed it off to a student, Thurgood Marshall, said, hey, listen, if you're an attorney, you're either a social engineer or a parasite, and there's no in between. I often quote that to my students to say, hey, listen, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. So when you get your degrees, I'm hoping that you will go out, cast down your bucket wherever you are, and work to enhance the life chances of people who are in need. So one of the things I do with my students is those who are interested in becoming lawyers, I say, hey, listen, consider becoming a DA or a prosecutor so you can get into the system and dismantle a structure that has long-standing customs and traditions that have historically kept people subjugated. So that's what I try to do as a professor. I try to steer my students in the direction in which, at the end of the day, they can get inside and revolutionize the system in a way in which we like to see it.
Thank you all. I'm sorry to the audience that I didn't get to all the questions. I tried to group them and get at least to the themes of your questions. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists for this really insightful and thoughtful conversation, to the Oregon Historical Society and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. And I'm going to turn it back to Judy.
And I also
Thank
just
you.
want to thank you profusely. What a wonderful conversation. I think we've all agreed that individually we can commit to doing the work, and together we can combat systemic racism. Those are our marching orders in a nutshell. But thank you so much for your participation. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and look forward to seeing you for real very soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thanks for having me.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.